and welcome to Comic Boom, the comics and education podcast. If you're interested in hearing more about the crossover between comics and education, then this is the podcast for you. My name is Lucy Starbuck-Bradley, and each week I'll be joined by a fellow educator, an academic, a librarian or a creator of comics to discuss their journey into comics and provide some inspiration to influence your practice. And hopefully shine some light on some titles you can bring into your libraries, classrooms, and hopefully onto your bookshelves at home too. This episode of Comic Boom is sponsored by ALCS, the Authors Licensing and Collecting Society. Hello everyone, on today's episode I'm very excited because I will be speaking to the Rickard Sisters, Sophie and Scarlett Rickard, who collaborate to create brilliant graphic novels. Sophie does the words and Scarlett draws the pictures, as it says on their website. They were brought up in the Ribble Valley in Lancashire, and a lot of their work features stories from around that region as well, like for example No Surrender, which we'll talk about in this episode. Scarlett has worked as a commercial artist, illustrator, signwriter and portrait painter. Sophie has worked as a civil servant, pub landlady, cabin crew and child counsellor, so a real variety of roles leading up to becoming graphic novelists. I love that. The Ragged Trouser Philanthropist was published in autumn 2020 by Self-Made Hero. It's a graphic adaptation of Robert Tressel's socialist classic. In autumn 2022, they then brought out No Surrender, also with Self-Made Hero. That book was a graphic adaptation of Constance Maud's suffrage classic. In this episode, we hear all about how they work together and collaborate on their books despite living 200 miles apart. As always, I'm really fascinated by the way in which people work together to create books. The Rickard Sisters are a great example. I absolutely loved talking to them, finding out about their work, about them, their approaches to adapting classic literature and bringing it to a new audience in graphic novel form. Really, really interesting, and brings such a new element to discussions around the role that graphic novels can have in classrooms and libraries. I think it's a really brilliant angle to take. Sophie and Scarlett are also part of our Lakes International Comics Art Festival collaboration. They'll be at the festival this year and talk to us a little bit about that. You may remember we ran special episodes last year in the run-up to the Lakes International Comics Art Festival, featuring guests that would be appearing at the festival itself. We're doing the same this year. I'm delighted to announce that the next 4 episodes will be Lakes International Comics Art Festival specials. A really interesting bunch of creators who will also be appearing at the festival at the end of September. So the festival is back at Bowness on Windermere from Friday the 27th to Sunday the 29th of September 2024. You can get tickets online if you're up near that way. I definitely recommend it. I'll be travelling quite some distance to attend, and it is definitely worth it from my perspective. The events include live draws, interviews, presentations, workshops, exhibitions, book launches, events for children with the Little Lickath activities. There's also a comics marketplace where you can spend more money than you intended to on comics. I'm sure I will be. And it all provides a chance to get up close and talk to and meet comics creators from across the world. And it really is an international event. So really looking forward to speaking to some creators who will be at the festival over the next 3 episodes after this one. Definitely recommend getting out to Lakes International Comics Art Festival. And if you can't, just checking out on their website. They've Little Lickath, their children and education arm, provides some really interesting and top quality resources for teaching with comics in the classroom too. So definitely check that out if you're teaching with comics or running a comics club in your library. Definitely recommended. But now onto the main event for this episode, talking to Sophie and Scarlett Rickard. Here's what they had to say. Hello, Sophie and Scarlett. Welcome to Comic Boom.
Hello, Lucy.
Hello.
Thanks very much for having us.
You are very welcome. I'm going to start the episode off, as I always do, by I'll ask Scarlett first. Can you tell me a little bit about your journey as a comics reader? Where did that all start for you? Was that from childhood or a little bit later on?
It's a funny one, this. I've never really been a comics reader, which is a funny thing. I think my first introduction to comics was, like a lot of people, Raymond Briggs. Our grandmother had Father Christmas in the room where we used to go and stay when we stayed with them. And we were there most weekends when we were kids. And so I remember reading that, but thinking that was the only book like that. I didn't know it was a thing that you could have comics. I thought it was just Raymond Briggs had done this one thing. And I remember just loving the observation of the everyday and the sort of absurdity of it was right up my street. And then much later, when I was about 14, I used to go down to stay with our dad and his wife down in Kent. And his wife had a book of Posy Simmons, like her sort of Guardian comics. And I was just fascinated by that. And I read it over and over and over again. And a lot of the references went right over my head. No idea, about that sort of highfalutin London dinner party set. But again, it was her observation. She's so good at just observing everyday life and pinpointing stuff like that. So I was into those things, but really, I'm not. Embarrassingly, I'm not a big reader. I do struggle quite a lot with reading like normal books. I'm not diagnosed, but I think I'm probably ADHD, and I just struggle with the concentration. And it's sort of similar for me with all books, because I need to put a lot of effort into the sort of concentration and blocking everything else out in order to absorb the information. And I always feel like I've got other things I should be doing.
Yeah.
So it's frustrating. But I think those two things were the sort of seminal comic.
And do you enjoy exploring now the other comics that are out there as an adult, or is that still something that you maybe do less for pleasure, more for research purposes?
I don't tend to do a lot for research, but I mean, there's so many fantastic things coming out, and I love, the style of stuff, and there's great stories, but I just don't have time at the moment to properly read anything because I'm always working. So I feel guilty that I'm not with it, about what people have been doing recently, because I've just been head down drawing.
Exactly. It's quite an all-consuming task, I imagine. Sophie, how about you? Was yours a very similar journey, or did you have a bit of a different path?
Well, one thing that you're going to realise from spending this time with us is that Scarlett and I are completely different from each other. We are, like, people sometimes ask, are you real sisters or like metaphorical sisters? I'm like, no, we are real sisters. We grew up together. We have the same parents, but we have not very much in common apart from that. So I had the Beano, like every other self-respecting tomboy of the generation. But other than that, obviously reading the same books that Scarlett read. But it's true that we just don't have like comics, what I think of as heritage. So sometimes the comics community, always the comics community is extremely welcoming and friendly and encouraging when one makes work. But we find ourselves feeling a little bit sometimes like imposters because we don't have this background steeped in comics culture. Like, we were not going to Comic Cons as teenagers. We were not reading any Batman, Spider-Man, anything like that. We don't really understand.
I have the same thing. Like, I didn't read a lot of, there's so much that I feel like people assume that you've read or accessed or been really immersed in. And I'm like, well, I don't really know much about superhero comics at all, apart from the movies. I'm more like I did read them as a child, but my passion developed more as I was an adult. And so, I'm more interested in kind of like stories about women and, and different things like that, autobiography and stuff that maybe people don't know much about outside the comic scene. So when people know that I like comics, they assume I'm talking about superhero comics, and it's like, no.
And it's a very exciting medium. It's frustrating when it's described as though it's a genre. So you have, the history section and the art section and the comics section, and it just makes no sense because the comics that we're making and the Batman, Spider-Man comics are not very closely related. It's a way of expressing it that's exciting, and it means that people aren't necessarily accessing it. So we have feedback that for quite a lot of our readers, particularly with the Ragged Trousered Philanthropists, that was the first full-length work of narrative art they'd attempted to read and they didn't know existed, which is a shame.
Completely. But great that there's something out there that you've made that can bring people into this. Scarlett, how did it then turn out that you're making graphic novels then? How did this happen?
Well, I have always been a drawer ever since I was small, and I think when I was really small, I just used to use it as a way of sort of processing what was happening around me. And so I just used to draw, every day as a sort of winding down thing, I think. I'm not really sure. But really early on, I really struggled to decide what to draw because there's just too much stuff out there. Like, it's so immersive, the world. There's too many things, and I could never just pick one thing to draw. So Sophie, who's always had stories in her head ever since she was really small, used to tell me what to draw to take the pressure off. So I just used to say, "Oh, Sophie, tell me what to draw." And Sophie would say,
"Frog on a bicycle," or whatever popped into my head. But I can quite clearly remember sitting at the dining table and it being high. Like, so I was quite a small child, but I don't know how young I was, and doing Scarlett saying, "Tell me what to draw," and I would say a thing and then add to it, and being told to stop breathing on you because I would be trying to work.
I don't mind that now.
I try and keep my distance.
So it was a natural progression really for us, because Sophie's a writer and I'm a drawer, and we wanted to tell stories, and so it was kind of we sort of fell into it because it was the best way for us to tell stories, and also the idea that if you work together, you're more likely to actually do something. You're more likely to finish a project. You're egging each other on. And so, like, I could eventually maybe have, written a comic or a picture book or something, and Sophie could have eventually written a novel. But I think the two of us together made it actually happen. So we combined our strengths. So the first book we did was an original fiction, which was Man's Best Friend, and we worked on that together for fun. And it was sort of like inventing comics in a stupid way, because we didn't have any proper reference. Just thinking about it now, looking back on it, it was like, we
didn't ask for any help. We just went for it, but we weren't taking ourselves very seriously either. We were just having a good time.
We just did it for the fun of it and really enjoyed it, so we decided to keep doing it.
So from that, did you develop a kind of a way of working that you replicated on your future projects? I'm fascinated by the collaboration that goes on with comics making. I find it really, really interesting how different people work together. And I don't know, Sophie, maybe you can start us off with explaining how that duo works.
So our collaboration methods have developed over time, but it's not that different to how we approach Man's Best Friend. So the main thing to understand is that we live about 250 miles apart. So we don't see each other in 3D very often at all. In fact, often the time we see each other is coming to Lycath, because we get to go on a jolly together. So we've been collaborating online since before it was cool. Since way before COVID, we were using email and FaceTime to get things done. But essentially it goes like this. We have an idea for a story, whether that's an original story or a proposal of a book to adapt. And then we discuss it a lot. And then I spend time in it and turn it into a sort of script, a bit like a film script, not at all like a comic script. So I'm not at all as prescriptive as what we have since discovered real comics writers do. I would not dream of telling Scarlett what angle to draw something from. Like, I will tell her what to put on the page if it's important for the plot, and I write dialogue. But I don't. But
you don't do it in the sense of like what panels are going to be there. Do you?
No.
You just say, this house needs to have steps to the front door.
So it looks like a screenplay, and it'll say something like, Joe is waking up. It's dark outside still, and he's wearing his pajamas. Like, that's the kind of direction you might get. And then when that's finished, we'll read over it together, and at that point, we do the most collaboraty bit, which is we get a lever arch file full of A4 copy paper, usually already printed on one side, because we're cheap. And Scarlett has a pencil. And we go through the script, and she really roughs out what is going to go on each page. So we can work out our lefts and rights, so we can get our double page spreads in the right places, so that we can make sure where the dialogue's going to go on the page. And we go through the whole book like that. So this is something we learned the hard way with the Ragged Trousered Philanthropist, but I'll never quite forgive myself that Scarlett drew a whole chapter that's not in the book. It got cut.
Yikes.
So we're much, much better at planning now and not wasting effort. And so when we've got that rough version, then it's over to Scarlett and I start thinking about the next thing. And what do you do next, Scarlett?
What I do next. So on the rough version, we have like code letters that are attached to the script. So every time there's a bit of dialogue, we have A, B, C, whatever next to it on the script, and I've put that in the speech bubbles in the rough, so I know approximately what's going to go in each bubble. And then I lay the book out on the computer in InDesign with all the panel layout and everything based on the rough. And then I draw it all on an iPad, which I used to feel really uncomfortable about that because I hated the idea of not having originals. It didn't feel like proper somehow. But actually, it's really changed my life. I can draw anywhere without making a mess.
Yeah.
I can just pick it up for 5 minutes on a train and carry on where I left off. And it's just, and also Sophie and I both have a connective tissue disability, which is genetic, not a coincidence, which means that I actually find it very difficult to draw extended periods on paper now without my hands going into spasm, and I find it really hard. But the iPad's really smooth, so I can draw for hours without it affecting me. Yeah. So what I do is I do it page by page. So I lay out chapter by chapter on the computer, but then on the iPad it's page by page. So I'll sketch it out based on the rough, and then draw it properly, and then colour it and do the lettering and everything. Because for some reason, I like to do all the lettering by hand rather than using a font. And then at the end of the day, I send the page to Sophie, and then we have a little chat about it and make sure it's working all right. And because often she's not expecting what I send her, because of course I'm imagining it different to how she imagined it. And so we have like a little conversation if something's not completely clear, or Sophie's thinking about something that we need to put in for later on in the plot that like needs to be in the background or something. I'll add those bits after that. And then when I've completed a chapter, we send it to our editor, David Hine, who is brilliant with all of this stuff. And he goes through the chapter and comes back to us if there's something that doesn't make sense. And
he gives us very really generous notes, doesn't he?
Really lovely, yeah, very generous. And has taught us a lot about making comics in the time since, because he started with us with the Ragged Trousered Philanthropist. Self-Made Hero, our publisher, put us together with him, and so a lot of the stuff he's taught us is real craft stuff that we obviously didn't know because we made it up as we went along. So we've learned a lot.
So when it came to doing No Surrender, we asked a Self-Made Hero if we could have Dave again, and they said yes, and he's also working with us on this one that we're working on at the moment as well.
So he's like the third person in the team.
Yeah.
That's brilliant. And how do you come about to actually sort of select the projects that you're going to work on? You've got 2 historical novels being translated into comic form. Is that what you see as your USP, or are you thinking of doing something different in the future, or what draws you to those projects?
It's a funny thing.
How it came about is Scarlett, I mean, I always blame her for this. It's Scarlett's idea. She explained earlier that she's not a big reader. And as I said, we're very different from each other. I am a big reader, and there's nothing I like more than long 19th century, early 20th century novels. Preferably everyone dies in the end. I like them to be difficult and depressing, if at all possible. And so Scarlett could see that, particularly in the case of the Ragged Trousered Philanthropist, that it's one of those books that people wish they'd read, but it's actually really difficult, and that there is a lot of value in the work that people are not able to get to because it's hiding behind 255,000 words of not. And so it's making the most of our shared talents to create something from the Ragged Trousered Philanthropist that people can access by using what Scarlett's good at, which is a picture telling 1,000 words. And so, of course, once we'd done that once, we then started realising, well, often people come say, have you thought of this? Have you tried this? Don't they? They suggest books to us. But No Surrender was like a sister to the Ragged Trousered Philanthropists in that it's from the same era, but it's telling a very different political story, but in a very similar way. So it's completely fiction, but it's written by someone who was there, who had boots on the ground and was part of the movement. So it's very authentic. And the one that we're working on now also fits into that category. Similar era, written by, it's raising the voice of someone who was there. And what we hope to do in the adaptations is not just to make them accessible, but to make them newly relevant so that people can enjoy the ideas that are in the story and to feel close to the people in a way that reading the history wouldn't, because you can identify with them.
There's something about sort of the Edwardian prose from this distance that's like a layer of thick brown varnish over the past. And I think it's hard for people to access the feeling that these are real people who are just like you and me because of that. And so one of the things that's quite fun to do is to try and scrape that back a bit and, you know, get our cotton buds out, whatever they do in conservation.
That's a great analogy.
And try and bring those people to the fore and just remind everybody that these are real people who had real lives. So that's part of the fun of it. But also with the Ragged Trousered Philanthropist, I attempted to read it several times, like a lot of people have, and found it really heavy going. But I also found the description fascinating because he was a very descriptive writer, and he described every tiny detail of, you know, painting a door or something. And I was trying to read it and thinking, God, if all of this description was in a drawing, the book would be half the length. It'd be so much easier to read. Yeah. And that's kind of where I originally got the idea. And I actually thought of that before we ever did Man's Best Friends. I didn't think that I would do it. I just thought, oh, how annoying.
Wouldn't it be great? Yeah.
He hasn't just drawn this. It'd be so much easier. So I think I must have had it in the back of my mind. And then, of course, when the sort of Corbyn movement in the Labour Party was happening and everyone started talking about the Ragged Trouser Philanthropists again, it made me think of the fact I'd thought that once. And so I suggested it to Sophie, because by then we'd done Man's Best Friend, so we were sort of a bit more like ready to do a new thing, and we weren't looking for an adaptation to do. We
probably won't be drawing Edwardian politics indefinitely. We've described this slavery, which is our current work in progress, as the third in a trilogy. So the three go together, and this slavery draws the threads of politics of femaleness and industrial labour politics together into one. So it kind of is quite a tidy way to end a set of three. It's another searing attack on capitalism and the patriarchy, but in one book. But Scarlett would really like to be allowed to draw a light switch one day. Plug socket.
Yeah, I just like to. It's all those little things you just never think about, like when you're drawing a character and you've got to think about them switching the light on. Like have they got electricity? Is it gas? Has the gas been cut off? Have they got an oil lamp? Is it just a candle situation? Like,
I was going to ask you about the sort of research that goes on, like just thinking about even just like the clothes that people are wearing and how much research do you have to do to get that right? Or are you not so worried about the details of that being completely accurate? Or is it more about the general sort of vibe?
You would think from looking at what Scarlett draws that she spends hours and hours looking up this stuff, but she just seems to just know it.
You're a time traveller.
We were brought up in a very sort of, I suppose, a very curious environment where our grandparents particularly were really interested in domestic history. Our grandmother used to show me, she had all kinds of weird things in the kitchen, Victorian implements, and she'd show me how to use them and stuff. And so
Amazing.
a lot of it is just in there somewhere. And like we've grown up with, old furniture, and our dad's a joiner. He specialises in old buildings. My husband's a painter and decorator, and I've done work with him. So there's and I've worked as a sign writer in the past. So all of these things kind of tied in together. But I do love a bit of research, though, it has to be said.
You've always been into history, haven't you? Like right from, like, you even enjoyed it at school and stuff. But you go shopping, don't you? When we first start.
Yeah, I've got Pinterest, and I go around like finding good outfits and stuff.
Cool.
So I go shopping with no money on Google Images, and anything that looks like, oh, I could imagine that person wearing something like that, then I just save it in the Pinterest for that person, and then I can go back and refer to it in the future. So like when I'm having to draw. Yeah, when I'm having to draw the same place, like the same room over and over and over again, it's quite good to have the original source material every now and then to just refer to. Like, I'm drawing a room that's got a grand piano in it at the moment, and every now and then, instead of using it from my memory, I'll just have another look at it just in case I've forgotten how it goes. But I'm very, very lucky in the sense that I've always really drawn from memory. I don't tend to draw from sight.
Got a very good, well, it seems to me, remarkable 3D visual imagination. So if you draw a scene from one side and then you start to draw it from the other side, you just know what it looks like already, which absolutely baffles me. I can't even reverse park. Like, I don't understand how it works, but it comes easily to you, doesn't it? That 3D imagination. Yeah.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, I sort of, I think of myself being in the room, and so I'm sort of in my head moving around and thinking about what's behind you and what's in front of you. But I love I love the challenge. And also what you were saying about accuracy. In some ways, accuracy is great, and it helps to make the reader feel immersed in the world, I think. But I don't take it so seriously that I can't sleep at night. I think it's like adapting for film. I think sometimes things will just not be quite right because you can't get everything perfect. And one of the benefits of drawing 1910 is that nobody's around now who remembers what it was like. So you can get away with a bit.
We have an overriding principle that the story and the communication of the story and the enjoyment of your reader comes first before everything.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so we will adapt for the enjoyment of the reader first, then accuracy, authenticity comes after that. So sometimes we will bend the rules to make it work. You've got to make the most of the medium, but also there is no point in making a perfect book if nobody reads it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Totally agree. Yeah. And
how
do you? I'm really interested in character because there's a lot of people in your books. Like, there's a lot of different characters, and I feel like they feel really real as well, and very distinct from one another. But in terms of the character design, it's not like a simple like, oh, that one's got a hat on, and therefore every time I see someone a hat, no, it's that character. They're very specific. That's how I draw.
Unfortunately, everybody's
stick a hat
got
on
a
them.
bloody
That
hat
technique.
on.
Yeah. Exactly. So how do you do that character design?
So it comes from the two of us being so different again, I'm just realising. So I've got quite an analytical approach. And so when I'm doing the adaptation, I try and distill. It's like having squash instead of juice. You've got to do a lot with the volume. So you've got to try and distill a character into their most essential features. And so I might end up cutting things about them that are less relevant to their purpose in the story, that kind of thing. And so I have this analytical framework that they go into. But then when I hand over to Scarlett, she has this really immersive style where she basically walks for a mile in their shoes. When she's drawing them, she does the faces, like she is really imagining being there with them. They feel very real. And so the combination of the two, I think, is how it ends up being that way. We do the other things, though. Like, for example, in No Surrender, we've got 3 prominent women, and we've got a brunette, a redhead, and a blonde. Because why wouldn't you?
Yeah.
Give yourself half a chance that people can remember who's who. But yeah, and trying in the Ragged Trousered Philanthropist, at least people kept the same outfits on mostly all the way through, so you can distinguish them by their clothes. In No Surrender, it was part of the plot that our main character Jenny would like go dressing up as this and then that, and so you've got to make sure she's still her when she takes her dress off, you know.
Yeah, and actually the characters in this slavery that we're working on now, again, you know, change clothes and experiences and stuff, and you have to make sure they're definitely still them. Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think I don't think of myself as being great on character design. Like, I don't put an awful lot of time and effort into it. I tend to, I've found that I can't really draw them until I know them, which I know it's all chicken and egg, but I can't know them until I've seen them living and saying things and thinking stuff. So I just start. I start the book and then get to know them while I'm drawing them, and then inevitably go back to the first few pages and redraw them at the end to make them
really
look like
interesting,
themselves.
and then readjust it back to the person that you now know. I love that.
Yeah, because it is really weird how they become their own selves very quickly.
You've also got some interesting likenesses in this slavery. We've got a mother and daughter that look related, that not alike, but you can see where she gets it from. And a father and daughter as well in that same way. And that's an interesting new angle for us. It's been fun to work on that.
Yeah, and as they, because in this slavery there's a time jump of 6 years in the middle of the book, so I've also had to make the characters suddenly 6 years older. You know, and it's 6 years is like a subtle amount of time in a way.
Yeah, exactly, because it's not like 20 years.
But at the beginning of the book, there's like toddlers who are now, you know, 7 or 8 or whatever.
That's a really interesting challenge.
Yeah, it is fascinating. One of the I find it a bit embarrassing, the one we're working on at the moment. The 2 main characters are sisters. And this is nothing to do with us. This was written by Ethel Carney Holdsworth, who wrote the original. The description that Sophie, because Sophie does like a cast list.
I have to confess, I made a PowerPoint.
She did. And it's been very useful.
Thank you.
This is very cute.
Yeah, she made a PowerPoint of all the main cast and then the sort of extras and stuff.
Love that.
You know? So I got to say, and also, God, Sophie really does love a spreadsheet. She also laid out the whole story and where all the characters reappear. So when I've got crowd scenes in this book that I'm working on now, the people in the crowd are recognisable characters that will recur later. And that was because Sophie had laid it all out, which chapter they were going to appear in and stuff. And
Brilliant.
so Sophie had given me a little bit of a description and described one sister as being like a dove and the other sister being like a hawk. And the way I've drawn them, I've accidentally made them really look like us, which is really, it's really embarrassing. If anything, I've turned into the character I'm drawing, because when I started, I had shorter hair and it wasn't that curly. And suddenly I've got long curly hair. And it's really strange. Yeah, I'm turning into her.
That is creepy.
I didn't turn into Frank Owen, but, well, I don't know, maybe I did. Maybe I did politically. I'm not sure. But it is fascinating the way that characters take on their own selves.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Can you tell us a little bit more about your next project? When's that going to be out? Is there an easy synopsis that listeners can to whet their appetite for the next book?
So this Slavery is a novel written by a woman called Ethel Carney Holdsworth, who started work in the mills age 11. Yeah. And then when she was 18, had her first book of poetry published. She was an extremely talented writer who went on to become a really successful novelist. She wrote romantic novels about mill girls, and one of them was actually made into a film in the 20s. So it must have been one of the first doing the film of the books. She was outselling H.G. Wells. She was incredibly successful. This Slavery is her unpopular book because she was so rude as to mix romance and politics. So instead of it just being a cheap romance for mill girls to read, it was a cheap romance for mill girls to read that encouraged them to go on strike. So the book itself is the story of two sisters who grow up working in the mills. Their father is dead and they live with their mother and grandmother in a little house in respectable poverty. And then it just very much like today, it only takes one thing to go wrong and they are destitute, because the difference between coping and not coping is a very thin line. And basically the story is about what happens next, and the two sisters choose very different paths. One of the sisters is a real firebrand, a very angry person, and she becomes politically radicalized and causes no end of trouble. The other sister has chronic illness and has the chance to get out of this life by marrying rich. So she becomes the other side, if you like, because she marries one of the people who ends up owning a mill. And so the two sisters' lives run in parallel in the same time, but having very different experiences. And it all comes to a head in a piece of industrial action that involves the whole town. And there's all kinds of skullduggery going on. And you really become involved in the moral tussles that the two sisters have, and also in their characters, how they choose to react, the choices that they make.
And the slavery of the title is to do with, you've either, as a woman, you've got a choice. A working class woman has a choice. You either work in the mill and you're a slave to the boss and the you know, where you're being paid real pittance, or you marry a man that you don't love, and then you're sort of under him. You've got no other option. And I mean, obviously, if you're lucky, you can marry a man you do love, but that's unusual.
But you still would belong to him.
But you still would belong to him. Yeah, you have no autonomy. So, yeah.
Carney Holdsworth made some really brave and radical points. Basically, raising the question is, what is the difference of selling your labour by the hour to run a loom and selling your body by the hour in other ways, and what is the difference between marriage and that? So the slavery of the title is about sexual slavery, it's about wage slavery, it's about how the entire economic system is underpinned by this unpaid labour of women, which is not completely gone away, has it?
No. That sounds
it's
brilliant.
Really well written as well. It's exciting. It's got a lot of riots and fires and lots of romance.
Loads of crowd scenes, loads of horses, all the things Scarlett likes best when I put them in the side.
Wow,
but
that's
I was just
excellent.
thinking another thing. I was just thinking, sorry, going back to characters, I was just thinking about the Ragged Trouser Philanthropist. The original story, I think, had something like 95 different people in it.
Wow.
And so Sophie had to do quite a lot of work at the beginning to consolidate some of those people into one person, or decide just to cull.
And that's how the spreadsheet works, because what I would do is work out what a person's function is, and then maybe merge three people into one. So the same person can keep coming back to provide a function, as opposed to introducing a new person every time. Or sometimes you might cut a whole B plot. And the other thing the spreadsheet's good for is if somebody dies or goes away, to black them out so you can't accidentally have them at the back of the room in another scene after they've died, because it would be really easy to do that. When you're drawing a page a day for 18 months, like, it's very easy to lose track of that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I can imagine.
Oh, yeah. And we're both really enjoying working on it as well, because it was written in East Lancashire, where we're from. So there's a real sort of sense of place about, like, the town itself is a character in this one in a way that it's not really in the others. And to the extent that we've been there and spent days there walking about, getting a real feel for the place, which we didn't do before. We've really thrown ourselves into this one, haven't we, in a different way, which is interesting.
Yeah, it's got real sense of place and a lot of weather.
Yeah, I must admit, if I never see a cobble again, I'll be quite happy. Wet cobbles are quite a challenge. Yeah.
I was going to ask you, so obviously social justice is a really clear theme in your work, and last year when we did a Lakes International Comics Art Festival special, this is the second year that we've done that, we asked all of the guests on those special episodes a question I just thought was really pertinent to ask you again this year, which is, do you think that comics can change the world?
I mean, there's a quote from Mark, Uncle Carl, which Sophie can probably remember better than I can, basically saying that all the novels and stories about economics and politics and the way people live, written by people like Dickens and Tolstoy and people, have done more for society than all the economists and politicians put together. Because all it takes is something like Oliver Twist, and people can imagine what it's like to be an orphan, or or what it might be like to be in debtor's prison, or like putting yourself in someone's shoes is a much better way of understanding a situation, I think, than being preached at.
So those realist novelists like Flaubert and Dickens and Tolstoy and people like that were getting into the homes of influential people who had the power to change things and asking them to have some sympathy or some empathy with people living in poverty, which was not really accessible to them before. And so stories change the world for sure. It's the only thing that really ever does. I mean, a really good example of that is the recent drama about the post office scandal. That's been rumbling on for years, but everybody was talking about it that weekend, weren't they? And comics have their place in that, because one of the real drivers as to why we operate in this medium is that there's loads and loads of different ways to tell a story, and there's loads of different types of people in the world. People are able to access or have a preference for different mediums. So there will be some people who, like me, like to sit in silence with a fat book full of words. And there are also people who would never engage with that content at all unless it was a film or a graphic novel or a play or a song. Like, why can't we have every version of a story so that as many people as possible can enjoy it?
So it's not specifically that comics on their own can change the world, but as a storytelling medium, it can certainly make a difference to people. And it's interesting. I mean, obviously, we're kind of riding on Robert Tressel's coattails, and and Constance Maud and Ethel Carney Holdsworth to an extent with the things that we've been working on recently. But it's so exciting when you meet a young person who's been so taken up with it that it makes them angry, or in fact, I was in a bookshop a couple of years ago, just after No Surrender came out. I was in a bookshop and I overheard a woman with 2 teenage children in the shop talking to the shopkeeper, and she was saying about her daughter. It's obviously her daughter and her daughter's friend who were in the shop with her. And she said, she's got really into this. And every now and then she puts it down and just goes, men. And I was just in the background in the shop listening, thinking, right? It's so fun when you hear people like really engaging with that content, especially like there was a young man who was obviously at university or something who saw us on one online thing, and he said, I've been trying to read The Ragged Trouser Philanthropy, but it makes me so angry. And we were really pleased.
So there's
Because
nothing we
it's-
like better than subverting young minds. That's one of the reasons we have done things like we've got the Ragged Education project, so you can donate the cover price of the Ragged Trousered Philanthropist on our website, and we have a big list of school librarians who've requested a copy, and so every time someone donates a copy, we send it to the next school on the list, and we've sent hundreds out that way, but we've got
That's
hundreds
brilliant.
of
I
names
didn't
that
know
are
that.
still waiting. So it's a really interesting way because what we find is that the fans of the original work come across the comic version and say, I didn't know this kind of thing existed, and want to share it. So many people in their 60s and 70s say to us, this was put in my hands when I was a teenager and it's changed the way I've seen the world ever since. And they want to pass that on. And so that's a way of doing it. And getting it in school libraries is such a great way of getting it in front of hundreds of teenagers.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Can you tell us a little bit about your relationship with Lakes International Comics Art Festival and what you're hoping to do or see this year at the festival?
We are really excited to be joining in this year because we're big fans of the Lakes International Comic Art Festival. It's our favourite one, and we've been going to it. We were discussing this earlier, I think, since 2017, which is much longer than we thought we had. But anyway, we've been going there ever since we first brought Man's Best Friend out, which we self-published and hawked about the place and took it to the lake.
In fact, we were remembering this, weren't we? At our first time at the lakes, we had Man's Best Friend and we were offering it to Karina Myriad. Is that right? And Daryl Cunningham was sitting at the table, and I think he insisted on buying one from us. And then he was
we were just giving them to people.
Yeah, he was the person who taught us that when you sign it, you have to draw a little picture in it. That's how comics naive we were, that we didn't realise that. And Scarlett had to quickly draw a dog in the front for Daryl. And I think about that so often every time we're doing a signing, and it's got like more and more elaborate. And I always think, it's that kind of thing. People are so kind, and the Lakes has got such a fantastic atmosphere for that stuff. And it's lovely to see familiar faces that you've not seen since the same time last year, but also to meet new people who are making new things all the time. It's lovely.
And I love the mixture of stuff, seeing things from around the world, that you wouldn't have any idea about, Indian comics and Russian, sort of documentary illustration. And, it's just so much fascinating stuff.
And they have such great guests as well, some real big names. I've seen people like that you wouldn't expect, like Ian Rankin. And, they're such a broad range. There's always something you didn't know you needed to know about until you got there.
Yeah. So we're really excited to be taking part this year.
Amazing. And are you going to be tabling? Are you going to be doing a talk? What are you going to be up to? Do you know?
We don't tend to have a table. What we do is we kind of tend to camp at Self-Made Heroes table and take advantage of their hospitality whenever we can. But they're very good to us. We are going to be doing a talk this time about collaboration and adaptation. I believe it's going to be called Collaborating with the Dead. So just cashing in on some October spookiness.
Amazing. To end the podcast, it's nice to have a couple of things to think about, maybe reflections on how your books could be used in education, or some reflection on your experiences and, what you would have liked in your time at school, or any thoughts around the role that comics can play in education to sort of leave us with.
I think part of it is this thing that we really feel passionate about, is that there are lots of different sorts of readers in the world. And I think the term reluctant reader has become a little bit of a sort of shame label. And especially for educators, that it's something that needs to be solved, and that somehow reading for pleasure is in itself a moral good, and it has to be a serious book for it to count. And, there's a really bit weird, all of that kind of edifice that's around enjoying fiction. And I think that to encourage educators to cast the net very widely for what kind of story enjoyments are available to everybody is the best way to make sure that people can access as wide a possible range of ideas. So there are people who have enjoyed the concepts and ideas in our books, which are quite, they're political economy ideas and philosophical ideas, but have been able to access them who would not have the reading capacity to have read the original. That's what we're in it for. And so to try and break down some of that stuff about what's a proper book and what isn't, what children should be reading. And at the same time and like when we said, why can't there be lots and lots of versions of a thing, to adapt and to work on something that already exists is great. If it's really good and you can present it in a way that then it reaches more people, why not? And that goes all the way down to early years. Like I just remembered that I accidentally said in a talk, and I feel embarrassed about it sometimes, that I described Burglar Bill by Janet and Alan Alberg as Crime and Punishment for Key Stage 1. But it's true.
It's true.
Yeah. And so, like, those things exist, and they are, like, Burglar Bill engages with some really big moral and ethical ideas, and it's told so beautifully and simply in narrative art in a way that people can access. Maybe Dostoevsky could have taken a leaf out of Janet and Alan Alberg's book.
Yeah. I think as somebody who has struggled, I mean, it's a really weird thing, struggling to read, but being able to write quite well, which it always confused me, because I thought, well, I can't possibly be dyslexic because I can write, but I just really when I try and read a book, all I can see is the pattern of the gaps between the words, and then my brain just wanders off and I just can't concentrate. I find it very stressful and frustrating, because there's a whole world out there that other people can lose themselves in, and I'd love that. I want that. And for me, that's, things like telly helps with that, because it's so immersive. And what we try and do with our books is to make an immersive environment for people who struggle to concentrate to really fall into. That's what I hope will happen.
And I just don't think it's that unusual to have a mind like Scarlett's. I think that there are lots of people who live that way, who are going around with this idea that everyone else can read, so I just need to be quiet and not make a fuss. And that what educators can do is to make as many different formats available as possible.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And that's, really interesting. And how, I think, just going back to your point around the different types of reading for pleasure and the different motivations. And as a part of my job at National Literacy Trust, I do teacher training on reading for pleasure. And one of the things we highlight is a study that was done in Australia about how, people read for information and get enjoyment from that. People read for, as a functional thing to improve the way that could be improving a skill that they need to gain. But they read it for enjoyment and get enjoyment from learning the skill through reading, and all these different types. The immersive play is just, and the kind of immersion in the story is just one type of reading for pleasure out of many types of reading for pleasure. I think that's really an interesting perspective, because I think it has definitely in recent years, the focus is on everyone should be reading for pleasure, and it should be fiction, and within the fiction, it should be a certain type of book.
Yeah, and I think for people like me, it's not for want of trying. Like, I really would love to. I'd love to be somebody who can just lose themselves in a book.
There's an interesting side of this that feeds into our process, which is Scarlett discovers or comes across or gets told about some obscure, depressing historical politics book, and she sends me, just read this. I have read some really miserable stuff over the last few years. And the ones we make into books are the good ones.
The other thing that I think is interesting educationally is the opportunity to bring people into the idea of what it was like to live in the past, and to try and get that sense across in a gentle way. I'm very keen on history not being boring, and people being able to really feel what it's like to be a normal person in the past, not Henry VIII.
And to humanise the people who were doing these things and to make their lives relatable. And I think No Surrender is interesting because you hear people arguing against votes for women, because the contemporary debates for and against, which is sort of a bit shocking, but that's what it was like. And you can relate to, it has reflections in modern conversations about things like climate change and Brexit. And so trying to really pull on the threads that make history now as much as possible so that people can imagine themselves in those shoes and imagine that those people are just people. It's not even that long ago.
It really comes through for me. I love that the characters really did feel like the people were real people, and that although the world's changed, people haven't, and we still had frustrations and ambitions, and you can get into the feeling like someone that worked in a mill, not happy, but just that was their life and they didn't know any better, when actually that's not reality, because humans aren't like that. Humans are looking across the road, humans are feeling tired, humans are all those things.
And this whole idea that because there was an infant deaths, that parents just got over it and carried on working in the mill,
and it's the same thing that you see in the news today, isn't it? When you see, like, it's the same sort of approach to when there's migrant deaths and things, it's this sort of dehumanization, really.
This kind of separation.
Yes, very much that. At risk of being political, I think a good example of that is the reaction to the war in Ukraine and the reaction to the war in Gaza. To compare and contrast how people respond to the human suffering on an individual level is very related to how much or how little people can imagine being in those shoes.
I completely agree.
And I think doing the sort of thing, doing comics, or things like Persepolis and Mouse, and those books really bring you into somebody else's entire world, so you can understand it. And those things are so valuable. And I think it's sort of important, when you're making stuff like this. So one of the reasons that the sort of criteria for the books that we've worked on, it's really that they are an authentic voice. It's first person, so it's written by somebody who's had a lived experience of what's happening in the book. Even though they're fiction, they're all loosely based on fact and autobiographical in some way or other. Constance Maud wasn't working class.
No, she was posh, but she was marginalised because of her gender instead. So each time we've been raising the voice of a marginalised group who's been trying to say, this is what it's like to live my life, and they've chosen fiction as the way to do it. And The Ragged Trousered Philanthropist is, like, rightly famous for being this first fictionalisation of a working class life, but No Surrender should be just as famous. But it isn't.
And this slavery really should be, because this slavery is like I think it's better than The Ragged Trousered Philanthropist.
I don't think I can wait for your version to come out. I think I'm going to need to read the original of the slavery.
It's great, but it's out of print. You can get it. I think Nottingham Trent University did an edition, and I don't know if that's. I don't know if it's widely available.
There's a group called the Pendle Radicals who made a podcast about this slavery, and that's how we discovered it. But because although Ethel Carney Holdsworth was really successful at the time, she later lost her fortune. I say lost, she spent her fortune on being a pacifist in World War One. She ran a literary pacifism magazine and poured all of her novel money into it and died in real obscurity. And the book itself is, of all of her novels, the political one, and so it's not something you're going to be able to easily pick up in Waterstones. It is, the prose is really, really good.
Our final question of the podcast, which, feel free, could be a picture book, could be comic, could be anything. If we were to add one book to our to be read piles tomorrow, what would you recommend? You can have one each. I'll be generous. Scarlett, do you want to start us off?
I'm going to say something really left field, which is typical of me. There's a book called Old MacDonald Had Some Flats, which was written, I think, in the late 60s, early 70s, and it's actually written in New York. So the original is called Old MacDonald Had an Apartment Block, but I don't think it's
Well, that's not as catchy, is it?
And no, I know. And it's basically, it's about the little people standing up against capitalist overlords. And I had it when I was a child and absolutely loved it. Didn't realise, didn't understand that obviously there's more to it than the story. But the story is, Old MacDonald is the caretaker of this block of flats, and the tenants are just hard work. And so as the tenants start moving out, he replaces them with animals and vegetables and starts growing carrots, and they're coming through the ceiling of the flat below and stuff like that. And the landlord comes along and tells him off and tells him to stop it, and tries to chuck him out, but then realizes that they could actually make quite a lot of money with a farm shop. It's really, but the drawings are great, and the whole sort of idea of doing something absurd but in normal surroundings, which is all. I love a kitchen sink thing, but that's got some absurdity to it. So yeah, that's a fun book.
That sounds great.
Children, children's book.
Yeah, that sounds brilliant. Sophie, what about you?
Well, I've already plugged Burglar Bill, which is very close to my heart. If I was a high school librarian or a high school person who is interested in reading for pleasure and broadening things, I would recommend a self-made hero title by Rob Davis called The Motherless Oven. There are actually 3 books it's a trilogy, and they are off the wall. It's an alternate universe where it rains knives, and it's about teenagers trying to survive in their universe.
Absolutely brilliant.
The art is beautiful. The imagination is so wild and so simply expressed that you have no trouble understanding the rules of this world, and they are not at all like our own world. But what I really, really like about it is that he gets really under the skin of the teenage experience. And so I think that if you were going to have some books to add to your graphic novel collection that you're hoping to entice readers in with, they would be a very good buy.
So it's The Motherless Oven.
The Motherless Oven, and then is it The Can Opener's Daughter, and then The Book of Forks?
Yes.
That they sound amazing and exactly the sort of thing that I love. I love something that's a little bit quirky.
Oh, you'd love them. They're
you're
really,
in for a treat.
really good. Yeah. And I know I've said something, but I'm not sure mine's even in print. So let me say something sensible. A creator who I really like is Guy Delisle, who's done quite a lot of stuff, the travelogue kind of stuff. His wife worked for Médecins Sans Frontières, so they were going all over the world and living in sort of war zones and places. And he's done these fantastic graphic novels about the experience of being in North Korea and in Jerusalem and in, sort of exploring these places. And they're very lightly done, but also really interesting and really give you a sense of what it's like to be in those places. And then he did a fantastic book called Hostage, which is based on the testimony of a man who was held hostage for a few years, I think 2 or 3 years.
I think if you're interested in comics craft and it's the medium being used well, they are really, really good examples of that.
And Hostage is really good for people who aren't big readers because there are very few words, because it's a man in a room
chained to a radiator.
But the way that it has the sort of tension of the situation, and and people speaking foreign languages that you don't understand, and it's really well done. So I recommend that.
That
definitely.
Sounds absolutely brilliant. Well, that's a great bevy of recommendations. So thank you very much. And thank you for coming on the podcast. It's been amazing. The time's flown by and I've really loved it. So thank you. It's been lovely to meet you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
the Rickard Sisters there. I really enjoyed exploring the topic of adapting classic literature into graphic novel format and all the benefits, and really fascinating the way that partnership operates. I loved the idea of the Ragged Trousered project, funding copies of the Ragged Trousered Philanthropist to go into schools and libraries. I'll put all the links to Sophie and Scarlett's social media and their website, as I always do, in the show notes. So if you want to access any information about that, please do. And I really recommend getting hold of their books. They're a really great read. Genuinely really enjoyed accessing books that I otherwise wouldn't have read, stories that I would not have been accessed at all if they weren't in that format. So that was really brilliant. And thank you for those excellent recommendations. I'm not going to give a recommendation this week because I did actually go out and get a copy of The Motherless Oven. If the Rickard Sisters recommend a book to you, my goodness, you go out and get it. And I did. And it was absolutely brilliant. I've only just finished it. It really blew me away. They are so right. The way that the world's created, there's so much I don't understand, and yet I just accept it because of the way that the story is crafted. A beautiful example of how to use light and shade in the artwork as well. Just it's all black and white illustration, but there's such dynamics within that. It's a really beautiful book to look at too. So I'm going to doubly recommend that book to you. And we've got something a little bit different. Normally in this section, since we've been sponsored, very lucky to be sponsored by ALCS, the podcast, I've been recommended some resources from their website. But today I actually got the opportunity to speak to Barbara Hayes from ALCS, who's their CEO, who talks to me a little bit more about ALCS's work. I think I've done my best to describe what they do and to promote their work, but it's always great to be able to speak to someone from an organisation about what they do and why it's important. It really does link really well into what the podcast is about, supporting the work of writers and the importance of literature and promoting that in what we do. So really interesting. Got a little bit from Barbara today, and then she's going to come back over the next couple of episodes where we'll talk about the importance of copyright and plagiarism education, and also the role of AI in all of that debate, which is really, really interesting. I found it absolutely fascinating to discuss. So yeah, this will be a new little section for over the next few episodes where we'll be hearing from Barbara. Here's what Barbara had to say. Hello, Barbara. Welcome to Comic Boom.
Hi, Lucy. Pleasure to be here.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. I'd like to start, as I do with every guest on the podcast, and ask you a little bit about your journey as a reader. What were you reading as a child? Where did your love of reading start from, and how's it grown to the reader that you are today?
Right. Well, when I was an only child, so books were really my companions growing up, and I think I was probably about 6 or 7 at primary school when I joined the book club. And literally Sunday was my day where I would read a book every Sunday, basically to keep myself company sometimes. And I remember things like The Wizard of Oz and Stig of the Dump and books like that. Yeah. I think that was the first one that I borrowed from the school library, and oops, forgot to give it back anytime soon. So I think when I left the school, they found it in my locker there. But I did also enjoy comics. There's one that particularly, and it's a 1970s comic, so I am showing my age here, but it was a really lovely one, and it was called Bella at the Bar. And it was one that I just remembered rushing to the newsagents every week. I can't remember what day it was that it came out, but I used to rush along and get my dose of Bella at the Bar. So for me, it was any kind of reading, to be quite honest, that kept me company, that helped me hone my reading skills and my understanding. And the book club was just brilliant. You know, a book a week on a Sunday was just what I looked forward to.
That's lovely. And do you think, in terms of that comic, do you think it was that kind of serial aspect, having to wait for the next week for the next one to come out, and that anticipation was part of what you enjoyed as well, do you think?
I think so. I mean, you know, back in the day before, you know, we were binge reading and watching everything as we tend to now. I think that anticipation was actually really good, because you're kind of thinking, oh, I wonder what's going to happen this week. Is she going to do something outstanding? I mean, this girl was really heroic at the best of times, and it was such a good person, and it was like there was a role model there, and it was just exciting, and you really could kind of you kind of almost morphed yourself into the comic itself. So you could see how you could be this girl's friend and what you would do, and then you think, oh my God, I'm not such a good person because I wouldn't have done that, but I would have done this. And I just thought it was in your formative years. I thought this particular one was really good.
Brilliant. I don't know that one, so I'm going to have to do some research back into 1970s.
It's probably not in print or anything like that anymore.
I'm sure someone will have a website about it somewhere, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk to you a little bit about ALCS in general, because I've been sharing the work of ALCS with listeners over the series. Very grateful to be sponsored this series by ALCS. It's been fantastic for the podcast. I've been sharing some of the resources each week and talking a little bit about the mission, but I'm sure I would not do as good a job as hearing it from you directly. So can you tell listeners a little bit about the main focus of ALCS's work?
Sure. I mean, I look at it as we are an organisation for writers. We actually have 125,000 writer members now, which we're thrilled with. We basically go out there and try and get money for writers that would be very difficult for them to get the money in on their own. We're called a collecting society, which means that we look to see where writers' works are being used that they're not already paid for, and we make sure that writers get paid for that use. We've been in place since 1977. Since then, we've collected and paid out over £700 million to our writer members.
Wow.
We collect money from all over the world now, not just in the UK, for UK writers. So it's a real good news story. It's not sexy. We're not out there in the mainstream around authors. So it's really important that authors hear about us. It's really about educating writers that, yes, they have their primary deals with their publishers, but also there's other money collected for what we call secondary rights, and that can be things like photocopying or scanning in schools, colleges, universities, businesses, National Health Service, government departments. And sometimes a lot of writers would say, oh, I don't class myself as writing anything that would be used in these various institutions, but it's amazing the diversity of the work that is actually copied or scanned or used in some way.
So do those institutions have to then report to you? How do you find out that something's been photocopied?
not always easy. So in educational establishments, we are part of a collective of authors, visual artists and publishers, and we mandate an organisation called the Copyright Licensing Agency to sell the licenses on our behalf to these institutions, and with that comes some reporting requirements as part of that licensing. And we get that information in, and then we try and make sure that the right writers get the right apportionment of monies for the uses of their works.
That's brilliant. I know some people that have been on the podcast have told me that that they've really appreciated being able to have this additional income is really valuable to them.
Yes, and quite often not the people that you would imagine, because it might be that somebody's written a maths or a geography textbook that just happens to get caught up in the curriculum. And I certainly know that some of our members have earned more money for the photocopying of their books than maybe in the primary market as well.
That's
so we do have some good news stories there.
Yeah.
A lot of members don't. It is quite complex about how we get the money in from all the different sources and different countries around the world. And people say, "Oh, we've got this money, and it's like ALCS is a magic money tree." And although we work hard to make sure we get that money in, it really is about trying as far as is humanly possible to make sure that people get the money that is due to them. And a lot of the feedback that we get from our members is in their statements. They like to see that their work has been photocopied in Sweden or Australia, or they get that
still
sense
being used
of
by lots of different people.
Yes, it's just a sense that work is being used around the globe. I just think it's job satisfaction when people can see they're getting paid, even if it's pennies, they all add up, and you start getting pennies from Australia and euros from somewhere in Europe, and it all adds up, and it's really nice for us to be able to pay our members. I think last year we paid out well over 100,000 authors, and we paid out over £45 million.
Brilliant. Great little intro from Barbara there. I loved hearing about her comics reading experience as a child. Brilliant to have some comics interest there in her reading journey too. Thank you, Barbara, for doing a much better job of explaining what ALCS do. As I said, Barbara will be back next week and we'll be continuing our conversation and talking a little bit about the importance of copyright and plagiarism education and how teachers and librarians can play a part in that and what that means in the world in which AI is here to stay and very much part of our educational futures. So really interesting discussion on that too. Thanks very much for listening today. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I love the Rickard sisters and I'm sure you will have too. If you would like to support the podcast, you can do so by retweeting, sharing on your social media platforms, letting your colleagues know about the podcast, and also by leaving reviews, 5 stars please, on any platform that you listen to. That all helps people who are similar interest to you to find the content of the podcast and grow our audience base. So thank you very much for all of the work that you do to support and share the podcast on your platforms. That's it from me today. My name is Lucy Starbuck Bradley. I'm the host and producer of Comic Boom. Thanks for listening.